Hi everyone. Today's topic is cerebral cortex. Let us discuss it under the following headings: Introduction, Functional Anatomy, different cerebral lobes, functions of each lobe in the applied physiology. Cerebrum, it is the largest division of the brain. We know that it is divided into two hemispheres, right and left, and each of the lobe is divided into different lobes. Cerebral cortex, so it is the outermost layer which has the gray matter, so making up the superficial aspect of the cerebrum. So here you can see the gray matter and also the white matter. So what is the role of this gray and the white matter? Why it is gray in color and why white matter is in white color? This gray matter, so it will be having more cell bodies, now cell bodies and unmyelinated nerves. So the axon terminals, dendrites, and all those things. So you can remember that. So this gray matter is in the center in the spinal cord, whereas you can see in the brain it is peripherally placed. The white matter, so white matter is composed of bundles of axons, so especially which are coated with the myelin. Functional anatomy, let us discuss it under the following headings: external features, cortical functional areas, phylogenetical division, histological structure, and the broadband areas. So here you can see the picture of the cerebrum, which has two cerebral hemisphere. This is a posterior view. Here you can see the spinal cord, and this is the cerebellum, right? So in the front you can see, so which separates the right and the left hemisphere. So in the upper part you can see it is separated by um, longitudinal fissure. So here there is a flex cerebri, which is a fold of a dura mater. So here it is in the upper part. In the lower part, the two cerebral hemisphere, they are connected by a white, so largest white commissure, so which is called as the corpus callosum. So in the lower part, the two cerebral hemispheres are connected by corpus callosum. The external features, it has three poles, three surfaces, and the three borders. Let us look into it one by one. So the three poles are the frontal pole, which is located anteriorly, and then occipital pole, which is located posteriorly, and then the temporal pole. So this lies between the occipital and the frontal poles. And then the three surfaces which we have to know is the superolateral surface, and then medial surface, so which is in the medial part, and then the inferior surface. So this inferior surface is further subdivided into anterior orbital part and posterior tentorial part. And then the borders, there are three borders in each hemisphere. So the first one is superior medial border, inferior lateral border, and then the medial border. So the cerebrum has three poles, three surfaces, and three borders. The surface of the cerebral hemisphere is covered by a thin layer, very thin layer of gray matter, so which is called as the cerebral cortex. So this entire surface of the cerebral hemisphere is folded with some intervening grooves of fissures. So foldings and the grooves. So the foldings are called as the gyri, and the intervening fissures are called as the sulci. So remember this gyri and the sulci. The gyri is the foldings and the intervening fissures are called as the sulci. So the cerebral cortex, it follows the irregular contour of the gyri and the sulci. So because of the foldings, it has the total surface area of the cortex is 2200 square centimeter. So the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So the boundaries separating the each lobe of the cerebral hemisphere from one another, uh, or mainly it is by three prominent sulci. The first one is the central sulcus. It will be here. The central sulcus we will see in the consecutive slide. It is also called as fissure of Rolando or central sulcus. So the next one is the lateral sulcus. This you can see here. Here it is the lateral sulcus, sylvian sulcus, or posterior ramus. So these are the different names for the lateral sulcus. And then finally the third one is Pareto occipital sulcus. So the two thing you have to remember is the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus and this is the lateral sulcus. And the final one is the Pareto occipital sulcus. But the central and the lateral is very important to remember. So these sulcuses divides different lobes in the cerebral hemispheres. So the first one is the frontal lobe, which is concerned with the motor function. So it lies in front of the central sulcus. So here it is. So in front of the central sulcus and it is above the lateral sulcus. And next one is the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe, it lies between the central sulcus and the posterior occipital sulcus. So here it is. So it is here posterior lobe is mainly concerned with the sensory function. Frontal lobe is mainly concerned with the motor function. And then the temporal lobe. So it is between the posterior ramus sulcus. Here it is. So it is separated from the occipital lobe also. So here it is. So it is mainly concerned with the hearing. So the auditory function. And then finally the occipital lobe. So it lies behind the parieto occipital sulcus. So it is concerned with the vision. And here we can clearly see the different sulcuses. Here it is the central sulcus and this is the sylvian sulcus and this is the parieto occipital sulcus. So here it is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and this is the temporal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe. So again you can see the different functions of each lobe. So the frontal lobe is mainly concerned with the motor function, so which issues the instructions for the movement of the body. And then the sensory lobe or the sensory cortex, parietal lobe. So here it receives all the sensation from all over the body, and accordingly it will give instructions to different part of the lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. And then the auditory cortex or the temporal cortex, so which is in the temporal lobe. So it is mainly responsible for the hearing function. So it receives the sense of hearing and act accordingly. And then so here you can see the Vernix area, which is concerned with the receiving and interpreting the hearing sense. And then the occipital cortex or the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe. So here it receives and interprets the visual sense, the visual informations. Broadman's area. So on the basis of number and thickness of cortical laminae and the cell type, Broadman has divided the cerebral cortex into 50 distinct areas. So this is, as I said, is based on the histological structural differences. So it is called as the Broadman's area. So this mapping of the cerebral cortex is very important for the neurophysiologist and the neurologist. So as they still refer the areas by quoting the numbers, so two different functional areas of the brain. So let us see how and how they have named different areas with the numbers. Cortical functional areas are subdivided into motor areas, so which is the motor function. So the primary motor area is Broadman's area 4 and premotor area is 6, frontal eye field is 8, and there are also supplementary motor areas, we'll see that later. And then sensory areas, they include primary somatosensory area and secondary somatosensory area, somatosensory association area, supplementary sensory area. So the primary somatosensory areas are 3, 1 and 2, and somatosensory association areas are 5, 7 and 40. So we'll discuss that later one by one. And then auditory areas, primary auditory area is 41, auditory association area is 42 or the secondary auditory area, and then finally higher auditory association area, that is 22. And then visual areas, primary visual area 17, and then visual association area 18 and 19. And then the other functional areas are the olfactory areas, so which is area 28, which is concerned with the smell, and then gustatory area, which is area 43, which is concerned with the taste. And then there are other areas like speech areas. So speech area, motor speech area was 44 and 45, and there are a specific area for reading, and then Vernix area for receiving the auditory function. So the speech areas, the Vernix area, so it is the auditory comprehension of spoken speech here take place, which is in the posterior end of the superior temporal gyri. So this is the posterior speech area or the sensory area of speech. And then the degenerance area, so the area 39, which is in the angular gyrus. And then externus area, so that is the motor writing area, externus area, which is in the middle frontal gyri. And then Broca's area, so that is the anterior speech area, which is located in the inferior frontal gyri. So here happens the detailed coordination pattern of for the vocalization. So in short, here when you read, so while reading words, so the occipital lobe gets activated, and while hearing the words, the Vernix area, which is for the comprehension of speech, so this gets activated. When you think about the word of speaking, then the Broca's area 44, 45, that's get activated. Here is where the speech production happens, and then saying the word happens in the motor cortex. So that is 4 and 6. So these areas are very important to know about the speech areas. Cerebral cortex, which is also called as pallium, it is divided phylogenetically into three. So the first one is the allocortex, so which forms 10% of the entire cortex, so which is further subdivided into archipallium, so which includes hippocampus and the dentate gyrus. And then the second one is the paleopallium, so which is the old cortex. Here it includes the uncus and part of the parahippocampal gyrus, which belong to the piriform area of the olfactory cortex. So since most of the allocortex is located around the peripheral margin, here you can see the peripheral margin of the diencephalon in the form of a ring. It is also called as the limbic cortex. So the ring of the limbic cortex functions as a two-way communication linkage between the neocortex and the lower limbic structures. So along with the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the limbic cortex is concerned with the emotional and the instinctive behavior. So that is the allocortex, which is the old cortex. And then mesocortex. So here it is the transitional zone between the allocortex and the neocortex. Here it compromises the cingulate gyrus and part of the paro-hippocampal gyrus and the subicule. And then finally the neocortex. So this is also called as an isocortex, so which compromises the rest of the 90% of the cerebral cortex in the human brain. So the actual extent of the neocortex has increased with the evolution of the mammals. So the comparative ratio of the allocortex and the neocortex differs in the rest of the animals. So in human beings, it is 10 of allocortex and 90% of the neocortex. Histologically, the cerebral cortex is made up of nerve cells and fibers. There are three types of cells which are identified in the cerebral cortex. So the first one is the stellate cell or the granule cell. So these cells form about one third of the total nerves present, total neurons present in the cerebral cortex. They have small cell bodies, so where the dendrites, they arise from all the direction, and it is present in the fourth layer. So with these cells, the stellate cells, and it is seen in the primary sensory cortex. And next one is the pyramidal cells. About two-thirds of all the cortical neurons are these cells. So they have triangular cell bodies, and axon, they arise from the base of the cell, and a large dendrite, they arise from the apex. So the processes of the pyramidal cells extends vertically through the entire thickness of the cortex. So these types of cells, the pyramidal cells, are present in layer 2, 3 and 5 of the neocortex. And then finally the fusiform cells, these are comparatively very few in number, and such cells have spindle shaped cell bodies, and they are present in the sixth layer of the neocortex. Layers or laminae of the cerebral cortex. There are 6 layers of the neocortex, which are numbered from lobe 1 to 6. So the first one is the molecular or the plexiform layer, so which has the transverse fiber, which are of apical dendrite of pyramidal cells, and the horizontal cells of Kajal, which are small, pear shaped of fusiform shape. The second one is the external granular layer, so which has numerous stellate or the granule cells and the lesser number of small pyramidal cells. So it is transversed by the afferent and the efferent projection fibers. So the axons end in the deeper layer, and then outer pyramidal layer. It consists of mainly the pyramidal neurons and some stellate cells and the basket cells. So the pyramidal cells are of two types. Small cells, they lie in the superficial zone, and the medium sized cells, they occupy the deeper zone. And then the fourth layer, inner granular layer, so they consist of densely packed stellate cells, and the inner zone of this layer is transversed by a prominent aggregation of transversely running fibers that is called as the external band of the Ballinger gel. The external band is called as the Ballinger. And the fifth one is the inner pyramidal layer. It is also called as the ganglionic layer. So this layer is composed of mainly the large pyramidal cells. So it is specially developed in the motor cortex. So where these cells are called as Jane cells or the Betz cells. So remember Betz cells, so which will be asked in your NOC examination. So this layer is traversed by a prominent aggregation of transversely running fibers, which is called as internal band of bile ledger. So in the fourth layer, we have seen that external band of the bile ledger. Here it is the internal band. And then the sixth layer is the polymorphous or the multiform layer. So here it contains neurons of various sizes and shapes. And many of them are modified pyramidal cells. So many spindle shaped cells, which is called as the fusiform cells, they are also present in this layer. So this layer also has cells of Martinotti, so whose axon project vertically towards the outer surface of the cortex. So this layer merges with the white matter of the cerebral cortex. Depending upon the local variation in the histological structures, the neocortex can be divided into 5 different types. So the first one is the, here it is. So far we have seen the different layers from 1 to 6. Here it is different types. So it is based on the various local variation. So here it is. The first type is the agranular cortex. So granule cells and stellate cells are completely absent here. Here there will be the pyramidal cells and the large pyramidal cells will be present in the Betz cells, and then which it is seen in the motor cortex and the Broca's areas. And then type 2 or the frontal cortex, here it is triangular granular cells are seen, and which is seen in 2/3 of the whole frontal lobe. And then the type 3 or the parietal cortex, so which has granule cells which is round in shape, which is seen in the parietal lobe and junction of the parietal temporal and occipital lobe. And then layer 4, or sorry, type 4 or the polar type, here the cortex is narrow. Here it is seen, this type of cells, they are seen in the frontal and the occipital lobes. So here all the layers are reduced in depth. So though you can see the cells are more densely packed. And then type 5 or the granular cortex, there will be excessive granule cells. So here it is seen in the sensory cortex and in area 41 and the calcarine region. Thalamus plays an important role in connecting all the areas. So each of the area of the cerebral cortex is connected to a specific part of the thalamus, each area. All the sensory pathways pass through the thalamus with only the exception of the olfactory tract. So except the olfactory tract, all the sensory pathways, it passes through the thalamus. So each of the cortical area is connected to one of the area of the thalamus. So when the thalamus is affected, the cortical function will stop immediately. So when the thalamic connection is lost, the cortical function stops there. So that is the importance of the thalamus in the cerebral cortex. Frontal lobe. So here you can see the primary cortex or the precentral gyrus, and this is the Broca's area, and this is the orbitofrontal cortex, and this is the olfactory bulb. The frontal lobe is divided into two main areas on the basis of its function. The first one is the precentral area, and the another one is the prefrontal cortex. So the precentral cortex is also called as the excitomotor area of the cortex. So stimulation of this cortex causes the activity in the discrete skeletal muscle. So it is also called as a sensory motor cortex. So nowadays the stimulation of the motor areas also causes some sensory perception. That is why it is also called the sensory motor cortex. Prefrontal cortex, so it is also called as prefrontal lobe or the orbital frontal cortex. So each it is located in the anterior part to area Brodmann's area 8 and 44. Let us discuss the important areas of the precentral cortex. So the primary motor area, that is area 4, and then premotor area, which is this is the primary motor area, and this is the premotor area, which is area 6 and area 8. So area 8 concerned with the frontal eye field, and area 44 and area 45, or it is also called as the Broca's motor speech area, and then the supplementary motor area. Primary motor area, it lies in the precentral gyrus extending into the paracentral lobule on the medial surface. So this area has all the 6 layers of the neocortex. So one of the special feature of this area is the presence of the giant pyramidal cells, so which is called as a Betz cell in the ganglionic layer and the thin granular layer. So that is why this layer is called as a granular cortex, as it has only a thin granular layer. Topographical representation. So different parts of the contralateral half of the body are represented separately in more or less inverted order. So those part of the body which carry out the most skilled movements, for example, the fingers and the thumb have the largest areas of cortical representation here, and you can see the areas of tongue, jaw, and the facial movements, they lie in the inferior part of the cortex. So those for arm, trunk, and the leg, they are arranged in the sequence in the motor area. Right, the parts in the paracentral lobule or for the foot and the perineum. So the body is represented upside down. However, the face is not represented in the inverted manner. You can see that, right? So body upside down except the phase. When electrical stimulation is given to the primary motor area, so it was found that motor organized is organized in terms of movements and not like the individual muscles. So the stimulation, it revealed the isolated movement on the opposite side of the body. So stimulation of points representing upper parts of the face, pharynx and the vocal cords. So that produced the bilateral responses. So it is the center for volition that is concerned with the initiation of voluntary movements of the contralateral half of the body and also initiation of the speech. Area 45, also called as suppressor area, it forms a narrow strip anterior to the area 4. So it inhibits movement initiated by the area 4. So that is the area 45. And then moving on to the premotor area. So it lies anterior to the primary motor area. So premotor area includes Broadband's area 6, 8, 44 and 45. So it is structurally, it is similar to the primary motor cortex except the absence of the giant pyramidal cells and the ganglionic layer. And it has two parts. So area 6 has two parts. One is upper is 6A and the lower is 6B. So the topographical representation so is same like the area 4. So the function is the integration of the voluntary movements and it also makes the skilled movements more accurate and smooth. So lesion of the area 6 causes hemiplegia with spastic paralysis. Frontal eye field area 8, here it is. So it is located anterior to the area 6. So its main function is concerned with the control of eye movements and it also causes conjugate movements of the eyeballs to the opposite side, opening and closure of the eyelids, pupillary dilatation and also lacrimation. So lesions of this area turns the eyes towards the affected side, the conjugate movement of the eyes are lost, pupil and the eyelids are not affected because of the lesion. So the afferents, they come from the occipital lobe and the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, and the efferent goes to the nuclei of third, fourth, and the sixth cranial nerves. Area 44 and 45, which is also called as Broca's motor speech area. So it is the special region of premotor cortex which is located in the inferior frontal gyri. So area 44 is situated in the pars triangularis and area 45 is located in the pars opericularis. So the function is especially in the dominant hemisphere. So we know that dominant hemisphere is in a right-handed person, the left hemisphere is dominant. So the dominant hemisphere is concerned with the movement of the structures which are responsible for the production of this voice and also the articulation. So which is important for the speech, right? Articulation, that is activation of the vocal cords. So along with the movements of mouth and the tongue. So which this area is very important for the speech. Supplementary motor area. So it is located in the medial surface of the frontal lobe. So behind the primary motor area. And the function in association with the premotor area, it provides the attitudinal movements, fixation movement of different parts of the body, and also positional movements of head and eye. Connections of the precentral cortex. So afferents, it receives from the adjacent area. So fibers from the adjacent regions like somatic sensory area of the parietal cortex, auditory and the visual cortices, and also from the opposite hemisphere. So the fibers that crosses through the corpus callosum, and it connects with the corresponding areas of the cortexes in both the hemispheres. And then from the thalamus, so ventrolateral and the ventro anterior nuclei of the thalamus. And efferents, so efferents from the precentral cortex, so collaterals and the pyramidal tract. So the collaterals from the pyramidal tracts, the adjacent area of the cortex, so the axons of the base cells, they send the collaterals to the adjacent areas of the cortex. So these collaterals, they inhibit the adjacent areas. So it is the lateral inhibition to sharpen the information. And the collaterals from the other pyramidal tracts are the basal ganglia and red nucleus, reticular substances of the brainstem, vestibular nuclei, and some fibers goes to the pontine nuclei and also to the inferior olivary nuclei. So then to the cerebellum through the olivocerebellar tract, and then pyramidal tract, so which is the most important tract, cortico spinal tract. So here it controls the motor cortex activity, so of the anterior horn cells in the spinal cord. So about 30% of the fibers, they arise from the primary motor area, 30% from premotor area and the supplemental motor area, and remaining 40% comes from the somatic sensory area of the parietal lobe. So these are the efferents and the afferents of the precentral cortex. Prefrontal cortex, so they have different broadband areas from 9 to 14, then 23, 24, 29, and then 32 and 44 to 47. So the location is the anterior part of the frontal lobe, which is anterior to area 8 and 44. So it is also called as prefrontal lobe, it's also called as orbitofrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex, you can see the areas here 9 to 12. So they lie in the superior frontal gyri, and also they extend to the adjacent medial surface of the hemisphere. And then area 13, it is located in the orbital part of the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. And area 24, it is located in the precallosal part of the cingulate gyri, which is on the medial surface, and area 32, they lie in the cingulate gyri, and area 44 to 47, they lie in the inferior frontal gyri. So let us look into the afferents. So the afferents, they come from the dorsomedial nuclei of the thalamus and anterior nuclei of the thalamus, and also from the Pape circuit, so which is also a has a close circuit connection with the thalamus. So this is the from the hypothalamus Pape circuit, and it is responsible for generating the resting electroencephalogram and also for the genesis of the emotions. Efferent comes from the thalamus, tegmental reticular formation, pontine nuclei, caudate nucleus, and the mammillary bodies. Functions of the prefrontal cortex. So it is a center for the planned action. So in association with the motor cortex, it helps to plan the complex patterns in the sequence of the motor movements. And then it is also the center for the higher functions like emotions, learning, memory, and the social behavior. And also it helps for various autonomic changes during uh, some emotional conditions. So it is because of the connections it has with the hypothalamus and the brainstem. Seat of intelligence. So short-term memories are registered in the prefrontal cortex. So it can keep the track of the information, and it also has the ability to recall this information bit by bit. So it is also called as a organ of mind, and it also controls the intellectual activities. So control of the intellectual activities by prefrontal cortex. So it helps to prognosticate and to plan the future. It allows the individual to concentrate on the central theme of thought, and it allows to delay the action in response to the incoming sensory signals so that the sensory information can be uh, well thought until it gets the best response. Consequence of motor action before their performance. So it allows to consider the consequences of the motor action. So before doing it, it plays an important role in solution of complicated mathematical or legal or and also the philosophical issues. And it also controls one's activity according to the moral laws. Parietal lobe, it lies between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. So it has the following areas: the primary sensory area 3, 1 and 2, and then secondary sensory area and sensory association area. So this is the primary somatosensory area. So this is the central sulcus, and this is the primary somatosensory cortex or postcentral gyrus. This is the somatosensory association area 5 and 7, and this is a primary gustatory cortex. So let us discuss the subdivisions of the parietal lobe. So postcentral gyrus or the primary sensory area, so 3, 1 and 2, and superior parietal lobe 5 and 7, these are the sensory association areas. So then inferior parietal lobe, which has, so the area 43, 40 and 39. So 39 is concerned with the angular gyrus, which is an important speech area. In area 40 is supramarginal gyrus, area 43 is parietal operculum. Primary sensory area, so it is located in the postcentral gyrus and the posterior wall of the central sulcus. So this is the sulcus, and here you can see the gyri. So histologically, dense stellate cells are seen and only few pyramidal cells are seen. Topographical representation, so it receives the sensory inputs from the opposite side of the body. So the representation of the body within this area is similar to the primary motor cortex. So the topographical representation is the sensory homunculus. So lesion of this area without the thalamus, then only the discriminative function is lost. So if the lesion is there with the thalamus, all the sensation lost from the opposite side of the body. Layers of the primary sensory area. So separate cortical zones are specialized for the processing of tactile and proprioceptive information. So broadband areas 3A, 3B, you can see the 3A, 3B, 1 and 2. So cutaneous input dominates in area 3B and 1. Here is the cutaneous inputs. And muscle and joint input dominates in the 3A and 2. So these are for the proprioceptive movements. Here it is the cutaneous movement. So just remember this diagram. Columnar organization. So the cortical columns that are located adjacently, it processes different sensory modalities as we have seen. So the area 3B responds to the cutaneous stimulation. So these two, they respond to the rapidly adapting mechanoreceptors, and 3A, so it responds to the deep stimulation, that is slowly adapting mechanoreceptors. So this is cutaneous and this is for the proprioceptive movement, deep movement, slow adapting mechanoreceptors. So that is why we have to always go with 3, 1 and 2. It is in this order. So you cannot change this order and say that if somebody asks what is primary sensory area, you cannot say 1, 2, 3. It is always 3, 1 and 2. You cannot change the order. Secondary sensory area, postcentral gyrus. It is located in the postcentral gyrus below the primary somatosensory area. This is the secondary sensory area or secondary somatosensory area. So topographical representation. So they receive sensory impulses from the primary sensory area as well as from the thalamus also directly. So like the primary sensory area, secondary sensory area also manifests the dermatomal sequence of representation, so which is called as the homunculus. So the body is represented twice in the somatosensory area. So in area 1 and also in area 2. So lesion of the secondary sensory area produce the defect in the discrimination power, whereas the sensory processing is in primary sensory area, so it is not affected. Sensory association areas, they are 5 and 7. So this area 5, they are located posterior to area primary sensory area in the parietal lobe. So there are few neurons, they respond to the tactile stimuli like the other areas in the primary and the secondary sensory area. So this area 5 also display a columnar organization, so which is said to be the point to point representation. And area 7, it is concerned with more elaborate process of discrimination between the stimuli. And finally area 40, this is higher association area which is in the parietal lobe. So they are more concerned with the recognition of common objects when placed in the hand without looking at them. So that is stereognosis. So a lesion in area 40 will produce the tactile agnosia. This is astereognosis. So this is area 40. Functions of the parietal lobe. The primary somatosensory area, it localize, analyze and discriminate the cutaneous and the proprioceptive senses. Area 3 is concerned with touch, pressure, position and vibration sense. So we know that area 3 is subdivided into 3A and 3B. Area 1 is concerned with the cutaneous and the joint sense. Area 2 is concerned with deep senses from muscles and joints. Secondary sensory area receives impulses from the primary somatosensory area and the thalamus directly. So it is concerned with the perception of the sensation. Sensory association area 5 and 7. So area 5, they react to the passive or the active rotation of joints and the tactile stimuli. Area 7 is concerned with the discrimination between the stimuli, whether it is warmer, colder. So it is to discriminate between the stimuli. And then area 40, it is concerned with the stereognosis. So we have discussed that stereognosis is the ability to recognize the familiar object in the hand without looking at them, right? There are some other areas other than the mentioned areas. They are the inferior part of the postcentral gyri. So they have the center for taste, and also another general sensations from the tongue. And then finally angular gyrus. So this angular gyrus, it helps in the recognition of the spatial relationship. So the tactile localization, that is the precise point stimulated, is accurately localized. And then tactile 2-point discrimination, that is 2 points of a compass placed close together are recognized as 2 and not as 1. And then navigation. So all these functions are concerned with the angular gyrus. Sensory homunculus. It is the map of the face and body surface of a human on the postcentral gyrus. So it is called as the sensory homunculus. What is motor homunculus? It is a map of the face and body surface of a human on the precentral gyrus. So that is the motor homunculus. So relative proportion of the sensory cortex is devoted to this area. So largely it is represented by the lips, perioral area. So that plays a major part. Here you can see, and face, thumb, and the other digits. So which has more receptors or more represented, right? The map of the face and the body surface is represented on the sensory and the motor areas of the brain. So that is called as the sensory homunculi and the motor homunculi respectively. Connections of the parietal lobe. So there are afferent connections. So the primary sensory area, they receive afferents from the thalamus and which convey the exteroceptive and the proprioceptive impulses from the contralateral side of the body, but from both sides of the face. So we know that primary sensory areas are 3, 1 and 2. So area 3, these neurons, they respond to the light touch and receive a dense input from the thalamus. Area 1 and 2, they respond to deep stimuli such as pressure and joint movements, and they receive very few thalamic fibers. But none of these areas receive any stimuli, or they will not respond to the nociceptive stimuli, that is the pain stimuli. The sensory areas in the paracentral lobule, they receive the sense of distension from the bladder and rectum. The secondary somatosensory area, they receive afferent from area primary sensory area and also from the thalamus. Sensory association area, they receive signals from the primary and the secondary somatosensory area. Efferents, so efferents, the pyramidal cells of the sensory area, they contribute to the corticospinal, corticobulbar, and also corticonuclear tracts. So all the somatosensory areas, they send fibers to the caudate nucleus and also to the putamen, and efferent also goes to the thalamus and also to tectum pons and also to the cerebellum. Temporal lobe, it lies below the lateral sulcus. Here you can see this is the lateral sulcus and this is the temporal lobe. So this is the primary auditory area, and this is the auditory association area, and this is the primary olfactory area. So primary auditory area, so it is the Broadman's area 41 and 42, and it forms the center for hearing, and it is present in the middle of superior temporal gyrus. So it perceives the loudness, pitch, source, and the direction of the sound. Auditory association area, that corresponds to the Broadman's area 21, 20, and 22. So this 21 and 20, they receive impulses from the primary area and are concerned with the interpretation and integration of the auditory impulses. Whereas area 22, which is also called as the Vernix area or the sensory speech area in the dominant hemisphere, so it is concerned with the interpretation of the meaning what is heard, right, and also the comprehension of the spoken language. Comprehension is understanding of the spoken language and formation of ideas that are to be articulated in the speech. So all these things happens in the Vernix area. So Vernix area is very important. So the functions concerned with the Vernix area or the interpretation of the meaning, what is heard, and also comprehension of the spoken language and formation of ideas that are to be articulated in the speech. Pathways for auditory communication. The primary auditory area is concerned with the recognition of the sound as a word, and then interpretation of the word and the thought that the word expresses. All these things happens in the Vernix area. And formation of the word that expresses a particular thought also happens there. And then from the Vernix area, so the transmission occurs to the Broca's speech area, happens through the articulate fasciculus, and in the Broca's area the activation of the motor programs happens for the control of word formation, and then finally transmission of signal happens to the motor cortex 4 to control the speech muscle for the articulation happens in the motor area 4. Area for recognition of the faces. So there is a specific area in the brain which can remember the faces, to store the faces. So that is the medial side of underface of both the occipital and the temporal lobe. Here it is. If there is any lesion over the facial recognition area, then the people will find it difficult to remember the faces. So it is called as prosopagnosia. So that is the ability of recognizing the faces will be lost. They can remember their voice, their conversation, their name, everything, but they will not remember their faces. Area for naming the object. Yes, there is an area for naming the objects. So that is the lateral portion of the anterior occipital lobe and posterior temporal lobe. So here it is. This is the angular gyrus. So angular gyrus also is very important for remembering the naming of the objects. So if there is a lesion over the angular gyrus, then they will forget the name of the object. So which is called as anomic aphasia. Occipital lobe, which is primarily concerned with the vision. So there are three important areas in the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex, which is area 17, and the visual association area 18, and visual association area or occipital eye field, which is concerned with the area 19. Functions of the occipital lobe. So the primary visual cortex is concerned with the perception of the visual impulses, and then visual association areas, say area 18 and 19, they are concerned with the interpretation of the visual impulses, and they are involved in the recognition and the identification of the objects in the light of past experience, and occipital eye field area. So they are concerned with the movement of the eyeball. So like other sensory area, visual area is also regarded as partly involved in the motor function. Area for initial processing of visual language, that is reading. So there is a special area here in the occipital lobe. So that is the anterolateral region of the occipital lobe. Let us see the pathways for the visual communication. So primary visual area, it receives visual input in the primary visual area, and then processing of the visual information happens in the parieto-temporal occipital association cortex, the angular gyrus, and then visual input reaches the full level of interpretation in the Vernix area, and then from the Vernix area it goes to the Broca's area for the motor formation of word from the articulate fasciculus, and then happens a transmission of signals to the motor cortex to control the speech muscles. Association areas. So there is a prefrontal association area which is concerned with the planning of the complex motor activity, analysis of thought processes, and motor control of the speech, that is the Broca's area. And then limbic association area, it is concerned with the behavior, emotions, and the motivation. And then finally the Pareto Occipito temporal association area. Here the analysis of the spatial coordination of the body happens, language comprehension happens where the Vernix area is, and then initial processing of the visual language happens, that is for the which is concerned with the reading and also naming of the object. So all these things are present in the Pareto Occipito temporal association area. white matter of the cerebrum. There are three types of the white fibers. Association fibers, they are concerned with the connection of different gyri of the same hemisphere. Here it is, here you can see of the same hemisphere, different gyri. And then commissural fibers, so they connect the corresponding parts of the two cerebral hemispheres with each other. So here it is, the commissural fibers. It is connecting the corresponding areas of the two hemispheres. Association, same hemisphere, different gyri. And then projection fibers. They connect the cerebral hemisphere with other parts of the brain like thalamus, brainstem, and the or the spinal cord. So that is the projection fibers. Let us discuss the applied aspects. The lesions of the prefrontal lobe, which is called as a frontal lobe syndrome. So they will be having the flight of ideas. There will be emotional instability. There will be loss of memory and also the moral senses. There will be alteration in the social behavior. There will be lack of attention, concentration, and the initiative. And they'll be having the euphoria. And then in addition, they'll be having hyperphagia, sphincter control will be lost, they will be having tremors and decreased intellectual activity. Effect of sensory area lesions. So sensory impairment will make them to lose their cutaneous tactile sensation and the temperature. So impairment of the tactile localization and discrimination happens. Stereognosis is the ability to recognize the familiar objects by using hand and without the visual contact. And then hypotonia happens, which is a decreased tone in the muscles. And then ataxia, that is incoordination of the movement. Lesion of the sensory association area, anosognosia. So that is the form sense from his own body on opposite side will be lost and becomes unaware of the opposite arm and the leg. So the patient forgets that other side is there and forgets to use that side for the motor activity, which is said to be amorphosynthesis. So the patients will forget the other side of the body. They will shave only one side of the body and they forget to shave the other side. They will forget that there is another side in their body that exists. That is amorphosynthesis. And then unilateral removal of the temporal lobe was done, and the following symptoms were observed. So that didn't cause any deafness, as here bilaterally is represented in the auditory pathway and project equally to both the cerebral hemisphere. So temporal lobe syndrome or the Kluver-Bucy syndrome. So it is the bilateral removal of the temporal lobe with amygdala and the uncus. Temporal lobe syndrome or Kluver-Bucy syndrome. So it is produced in animals, particularly in the monkeys, after the removal of the bilateral temporal lobe along with the amygdala and the uncus. So they have seen the following features. So hyperphagia and the omniphagia. So they started eating more, and also they started eating the diet which they have never ever tasted. So that is somniphagia. And hypersexuality. So this is due to the damage to the amygdaloid nuclei. Hyperorality. So increased oral activity. So they repeatedly put something in their mouth to all the movable objects that is present in the surrounding. Hyper metamorphosis. So they start responding to every stimuli. So whether it is experienced before or not, they start responding to all the stimuli. So that is hyper metamorphosis. There is visual agnosia. It is the inability to recognize the objects in spite of good vision. And then aphasia. So there will be disturbances in the speech, and then dreaming state. So these animals are not aware of their own activities, and they have the feeling of the unreality. So that is the dreaming state. And auditory disturbances in the form of frequent attacks of tinnitus and auditory hallucinations happens. Vernix aphasia, it is the destruction of the Vernix area. So destruction of visual and the auditory association areas result in an inability to understand the written or the spoken word. So interpretation happens here. So if there is a lesion over the vernix area, they will not be able to understand what is written or spoken. Occipital lobe lesion, visual agnosia, it is the inability to recognize the objects by the vision, and the word blindness, pure word blindness, it is concerned with the inability to read. Cerebral dominance. So we humans have two hemispheres, right? So it is not that one of the hemisphere is really dominant over the other hemisphere. It is the functions. So the motor functions and the speech areas in one of the hemisphere are highly developed, and they are called as the dominant hemispheres. So it is the functionality and not the anatomical structure. So in approximately 95% of all the individuals, the left hemisphere is dominant regardless of the handedness. The motor area concerned with the hand movements is closely associated with the center for the speech. So this explains the right-handedness in over 90% of the individuals. And right hemisphere dominance is seen in only 15% of the left-handers. And 70% of the left-handers also have left hemisphere dominance. So it can be either way. So the two halves, both the hemispheres of the brain can get connected through the corpus callosum. So by these uh, connections, so the information stored in one of the hemisphere can be availed in the another hemisphere. So the activities can be coordinated. So you can see the both the hemispheres have different functions, and it can store and do particular functions accordingly. So the left hemisphere have different functions than the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, they have the control of the muscle on the right side of the body, and it controls the language. It does the solving the problems, logical thinking, speech areas, analysis, and the intellectual area, where the right side, as mostly there is the left hemisphere dominance, it is projected as such. So you can see the right side, which is very colorful, like so. All the imagination happens here. So it controls the muscles on the left side of the body, and spatial abilities happens, and facial recognition, the recognition of the face, visual imaginary things happen here, art and music, emotion, creativity, and the you can easily differentiate that which side is activated on a particular person. So it is only the functional difference, but there is an anatomical difference. Whether is there any anatomical difference in both the hemisphere? If there is anything, you can comment it in the chat box or text me personally. Thank you. Summary. So frontal lobe is concerned with the behavior, intelligence, memory, and the movement. Parietal lobe is concerned with the intelligence, language, reading, sensation. And temporal lobe is concerned with the speech, hearing, and long-term memory. And occipital lobe is concerned with the visual processing and spatial orientation. Books to read: G.K. Paul, In the Purana, Guyton and Hall, and William Gannon. Thank you for your attention.